There is a number that has followed Moctezuma for 500 years. 3,000 women. Some said 4,000. Locked, the story goes, inside the most magnificent palace anyone in the world had ever seen. You have probably heard that number. It is in the documentaries. It is in the textbooks. And almost none of it is true. Here is what is true. When the Spanish were finished, the women of that palace were gone. Not exiled, not pensioned off. Gone. Branded on the face with a hot iron in the shape of a single letter, sorted on a lake shore by soldiers who reached under their skirts looking for gold. Some of them smeared mud across their faces and put on rags, hoping to be passed over. But one woman in that palace did not disappear. She was Moctezuma's daughter. She would marry 2 emperors and 3 conquerors, bury all 5, and become the single thread that carried the blood of the Aztec kings into the courts of Spain. Her descendants are alive today. One of them is a duke, and the Spanish crown paid her family for 400 years until a Mexican president finally stopped the checks in 1934. This is what really happened to the women of Moctezuma's house. Tenochtitlan, the autumn of 1519. A city of perhaps 250,000 people, built on an island in a lake, larger than any city in Spain. At its centre stood a palace complex so strange that the men who walked into it could not find words for it. A zoo with 300 keepers, an aviary, a hall of human curiosities, gardens that grew nothing but flowers, because food plants were considered beneath a king's garden, and a wing for the women of the household. The men who would later write about that wing were soldiers and chaplains. They came from a Europe that had one word for a powerful man surrounded by women, and that word was harem. So that is the word they used. It was the wrong word. And to understand what was actually taken, you have to understand what was actually there. Let me introduce you to the source. His name was Francisco López de Gomara. He was a priest, a scholar, and after the conquest he became the household chaplain of Hernán Cortés back in Spain. In 1552, he published a sweeping history of the conquest of Mexico that became a bestseller across Europe. There is one detail about Gomara you should hold on to. He never went to Mexico. Not once. He never saw Tenochtitlan, never saw the palace, never saw a single one of the women he was about to make famous. In his chronicle, Gomara wrote that Moctezuma kept 1,000 women. Then he hedged. Some affirm 3,000, he added, counting ladies, servants and slaves together, and then came the line that would echo for 5 centuries. There was a time, he claimed, when Moctezuma had 150 of them pregnant at once. 150. At once. It is a spectacular number. It is also, almost certainly, a piece of theatre. Because there was another man who wrote about that palace, and he had a very different problem. His name was Bernal Diaz del Castillo, and he had actually been there. He had walked through the rooms. He had eaten in the halls. He was an old soldier, and late in his life he sat down to write his own history, specifically because he was furious at chroniclers like Gomara, who had never seen the place, describing it as if they had. And when Bernal, the eyewitness, described Moctezuma's women, he did not write 3,000. He wrote that the emperor had many women as companions, daughters of lords and chieftains, but 2 legitimate wives who were rulers in their own right. Many, 2 queens. That is the testimony of the man who was in the room. So which number made it into the textbooks? The eyewitness who said many, or the chaplain in Spain who said 3,000 and 150 pregnant at once? You already know the answer. The bigger number always wins. It is more shocking, it sells more books, and it makes the man you are about to conquer look like a decadent tyrant who deserved it. That last part mattered more than anyone admitted. So if it wasn't a harem of 3,000, what was it? Modern historians who study the Aztec palace, scholars like Susan Toby Evans, have reconstructed something far more interesting than the fantasy. The women of the palace were the single most valuable economic engine the emperor controlled, and the reason was cloth. In the Aztec world, there were no coins. Tribute was paid in cacao beans, in feathers, and above all in finely woven textiles. A cloak of a certain quality had a fixed exchange value, the way a banknote does. And who wove the finest cloth in the empire? The women of the royal household. Every secondary wife who came into that palace arrived from an allied noble family, and she did not come alone. She came with her women, her looms, and her skill. She was a political alliance, a treaty, and a textile workshop all at once. So when Gamarra looked at that wing and saw 3,000 concubines, what he was actually looking at was something closer to a central bank, a foreign ministry, and a royal manufacturing house, staffed by women whose marriages held the empire's alliances together. Some of them were Moctezuma's sexual partners. Many were not. The European eye flattened all of it into one word, because one word was easier to sell. And no, that is not a modern historian going soft on the past. That is what the tribute records themselves show. Here is what we can actually establish. Moctezuma had two principal wives. One was a princess from the city of Ecatepec, and Moctezuma thought so highly of her standing that he made her co-ruler of that city. The other was named Teotlalco, and she was the mother of the one daughter whose name the entire rest of this story depends on. Beyond the two queens were a handful of documented secondary wives, each from a noble house, and beyond them an unknown number of other women, dozens, perhaps more. And the children. Spanish chroniclers counted at least 18 sons considered fit to inherit, and so many daughters that no one bothered to keep a full list. The total number of Moctezuma's children may have passed 100. Most of those children would be dead within 2 years. But a few of them were about to become the most legally valuable human beings in the entire Spanish Empire. They just didn't know it yet. On the 8th of November 1519, Hernán Cortés walked into Tenochtitlan with around 400 Spaniards, a few thousand Tlaxcalan allies who hated the Mexica, and a Nahua woman the Spanish called Doña Marina, who translated every word. Moctezuma met him on the causeway. The two most powerful men in that hemisphere stood face to face. The Spanish were not housed in Moctezuma's own residence. They were given the older palace next door, the palace of Moctezuma's father, Axayacatl. Remember that building. It is where the women of the household and the Spanish soldiers would spend the next 7 months living side by side. And it is where many of them would die. Within days, the relationship curdled. The Spanish, terrified and outnumbered in the heart of a city they did not understand, took the unthinkable step of seizing the emperor inside his own capital and holding him as a hostage in his own father's palace. Moctezuma, astonishingly, complied. He kept his court, he kept his routines, he kept his women around him. And according to the chronicler Hugh Thomas, he offered the Spanish servants by the hundreds and offered Cortés one of his own daughters. 3 of those daughters were placed directly under Cortés's personal care. Were they gifts, hostages, concubines? A Russian ethno-historian who studied the favourite daughter's life put it best. They were all 3 at once. There was no version of being a young woman in that palace, in that winter, that was safe. One of those 3 daughters was a girl of about 10 named Tecuichpoch. If you forget every other name in this video, remember hers. The Spanish had months before it all came apart. The clock had already started. By the early summer of 1520, the city had turned. The Spanish had massacred Aztec nobles during a religious festival. Moctezuma was dead, killed either by stones thrown by his own disillusioned people, as the Spanish claimed, or quietly murdered by the Spanish once he had stopped being useful, as the Mexica remembered it. We genuinely cannot resolve which. Both versions were written by people with reasons to lie. What happened next has a name. The Spanish call it La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Trapped, starving and surrounded, Cortés decided to break out of the city in the dark. He took the treasure, and he took Moctezuma's children with him as hostages. The retreat became a slaughter. The causeway bridges failed. Men weighed down with looted gold sank into the lake and drowned. The Mexica attacked from canoes on both sides. By dawn, a huge portion of Cortés's force was dead in the water. And here is the detail the textbooks skip. Almost every indigenous woman attached to the Spanish camp died that night. The cooks, the translators, the hostage daughters of the emperor, the women who had been handed over as servants months earlier. Most of them never reached the far shore. The gold sank with the men who couldn't let go of it. The women were never given the choice to let go of anything. So, yeah, not a good night. A handful survived. Doña Marina, the translator. A Spanish woman named Maria de Estrada. And at least one of Moctezuma's daughters under Cortés's direct protection, almost certainly the girl Tecuichpoch. A second daughter died on that causeway, leaving behind an infant. A third simply vanishes from the record. Out of the emperor's enormous family, the survivors could now be counted on one hand. Cortés escaped the city that night with almost nothing, but he carried out one idea that would haunt the women of central Mexico for years. That's getting ahead of the story. Almost. Cortés regrouped among his Tlaxcalan allies and began to take his revenge on the towns around the lake, one by one. And in a town called Tepeaca, late in 1520, he commissioned a piece of metalwork that tells you everything about what was coming. It was a branding iron. The letter was G. It stood for guerra, war. Any person captured in what the Spanish chose to call a just war could be branded on the face with that letter and legally enslaved. And Cortés stretched the definition of a just war until it covered almost anyone. We know the exact shape of that iron and exactly what it meant because the old soldier, Bernal Diaz, described it himself, with the flat precision of a man recording a fact he was not proud of. Women were branded alongside men. And then Bernal recorded something even uglier about how the system worked in practice. The night before a mass branding, the captured people would be gathered together to be divided up. The crown took its fifth, Cortés took his fifth, the captains took their shares. And in the morning, Bernal wrote, the best of the women would have vanished overnight. The officers had taken the ones they wanted before the common soldiers ever drew lots. Think about what that sentence actually admits. The branding of human beings was not even the part that bothered him. What bothered him was that the officers were skimming the women first. That is the level we are operating at now. After a while, the soldiers stopped handing over the women they captured at all. They hid them. They lied and said these were free servants who had come along willingly. Which means the historical record of these women's fate was being falsified in real time by the very men who took them. For most of this story, the women are silent because the men with the pens did not think to ask them anything. But there is one source that comes from the other side. After the conquest, a Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades working with Nahua elders and scribes in Tlatelolco, recording their memory of the war in their own language. The result is called the Florentine Codex. Book 12 is the Conquest, told by the people who lost it, and Book 12 describes the final day. The 13th of August, 1521. After 90 days of siege, after the people inside had eaten the animals from Moctezuma's own zoo to survive, the city surrendered. The survivors walked out across the causeways, starving, to be processed by the conquerors. The Codex says the Spanish were searching for gold, and they searched the women's bodies for it, under their skirts, against their stomachs. And then it says something that no Spanish chronicle ever bothered to record. The soldiers picked out the beautiful women, and it describes how some of the women escaped being chosen. They covered their faces with mud. They put on old rags instead of their own clothes. They made themselves look poor and sick and worthless so that they would not be selected. That is the closest we will ever come to hearing these women speak. Not a number in a chaplain's book. A memory, preserved by their own people, of the morning they smeared mud on their own faces and prayed to be overlooked. Whatever the wing of that palace had been, an alliance, a treasury, a workshop, a harem, this is how it ended, on a lakeshore, in disguise, hoping to be ignored. The 3,000 was always the wrong thing to focus on. This is the part that should have been in every textbook. It almost never is. If you are finding this story as gripping and as unsettling as the people who lived it, I covered the fall of another royal house this way, the Ottoman dynasty, and what happened to the Sultan's family when their 600-year empire ended in a single morning. I'll point you to it at the end. For now, stay with me, because the story of the women of this palace does not actually end on that lakeshore. Because while the women of Tenochtitlan were being branded and sorted, something else was quietly being arranged. And it involved the one daughter who survived the Night of Sorrows. Her birth name was Tecuichpoch Ishkasho. She was born around 1509, the daughter of Moctezuma and his principal wife Teotlalco, which made her, by the rules of her own world, the most legitimate heir the emperor had. And her life had already been extraordinary before a single Spaniard touched it. By the time the conquest reached its climax, she had been married into the highest level of Mexican power again and again. She had been wed to a great Aztec war leader. After her father's death, she was married to her uncle Tecuichpoch, who became the next emperor. and who was dead of smallpox within 80 days. Then she was married to her cousin Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor of the Aztecs, the man who led the final defense of the city. Cuauhtémoc surrendered on that final day in August 1521. His one condition was that his family be protected. Cortés agreed, and then had Cuauhtémoc's feet burned with oil to make him reveal where the lost gold was. Cuauhtémoc told them nothing. 4 years later, on a disastrous expedition into the jungle, Cortés had him hanged from a tree. So before her 17th birthday, Tecuichpoch had been the wife of 2 reigning Aztec emperors and watched both die, one of plague, one on a rope. And the conquerors now held her because they had worked out something important. This girl was not just a survivor, she was a deed of ownership. Here is the piece of Spanish law that changed everything. The crown did not treat indigenous kings as rebels to be erased. It treated them as natural lords, legitimate sovereigns whose bloodline carried real legal weight. Which meant Moctezuma's daughter was not a prisoner of war. She was an heiress. And whoever controlled her marriage controlled a claim to the richest lands in the New World. Cortés understood this immediately. He had her baptized a Christian and renamed her Isabel after the Queen of Spain. He declared, citing a deathbed wish from Moctezuma that he had not actually witnessed, that Isabel was the emperor's principal and legitimate heir. And then he began marrying her off to his own men. Her first Spanish husband was a man named Alonso de Grado, and as her dowry, Cortés handed over one of the greatest prizes in Mexico, the estate of Tacuba. Tacuba had been one of the 3 capital cities of the Aztec Empire itself. The grant gave its holder the labour and tribute of more than 300 villages. It was the largest such grant in the entire Valley of Mexico. That was Isabel's value, made concrete. An entire former capital, handed to whichever Spaniard held her hand in marriage. Grado was dead within a year, and if that had been the worst of it, Isabel's story might be one of grim political survival and nothing more. But then came the part that her own descendants today describe as a crime. Widowed, Isabel was brought back into Cortés's own household, and there she became pregnant by Cortés himself. The 16th century Spanish sources describe it lightly, as a liaison. Modern historians and Isabel's living descendants use a different word. She was a widowed teenager living in the conqueror's house, with no surviving male relative left alive to protect her, and an absolute imbalance of power between them. We cannot prove what happened in that house, but we can see the shape of it clearly enough. The child was a girl, Leonor Cortés Moctezuma. And here is the detail that tells you how Isabel felt about it. As soon as the pregnancy showed, Cortés quickly married Isabel off to yet another of his men, took the baby away, and had the child raised by relatives. Isabel refused to recognize her own daughter. She would not raise the child of the man who had toppled her family and used her body. That refusal is the loudest thing this silent woman ever did. Isabel married one more time, to a Spaniard named Juan Cano de Saavedra, and with him she finally had something like stability. 6 children, a vast estate. The tribute of Tacuba flows year after year. By the time she died, around 1550, Isabel Moctezuma was the wealthiest indigenous woman in the New World, and one of the wealthiest women in the colony of any background. And she did one last thing that cuts against everything around her. Isabel herself owned enslaved people. It was the brutal norm of her class and her time. But in her will, she freed every one of them and left them money. A woman people had been branded on the face and sorted on a lakeshore, made sure that the people she owned would walk away free with something in their hands. She had seen exactly what bondage looked like from both sides. Most people in her position never acted on that. She did. But here is why Isabel matters to this story, above all the others. She did not just survive, she became a root. Through her children with Juan Cano, the blood of the Aztec emperors entered the Spanish aristocracy directly, and she was not the only one. Her half-sister, baptized as Doña Mariana, was given the city of Ecatepec and married Spanish nobles. Her line scattered north into what is now Jalisco, Aguascalientes and Zacatecas, and survives there today. And Moctezuma's son Pedro, who had been hidden as a child during the war, was recognized as a legitimate heir, given the ancient Toltec capital of Tula, and travelled to Spain to stand before the Holy Roman Emperor himself, who granted him a coat of arms in recognition of his royal Aztec blood. That son's grandson would do something none of them could have imagined. He would move to Spain for good. And a century after the conquest, his family would be given a title that turned the bloodline of the conquered emperor into something the kings of Spain were proud to claim. On the 13th of September, 1627, King Philip IV of Spain ennobled a great-grandson of Moctezuma. He created him the Count of Moctezuma. A descendant of the emperor whose empire Spain had destroyed was now a Spanish count, with lands and an honoured place at court. It kept climbing. In 1766, King Charles III attached the highest rank of Spanish nobility to the title, the Grandeza de España, making the family grandees of Spain. And in one detail almost too strange to believe, a man married into the Moctezuma family served as the viceroy of New Spain, the king's personal ruler over Mexico at the end of the 17th century. Let me put that plainly. A descendant of Moctezuma's house governed the conquered Aztec lands in the name of the Spanish king. The emperor's blood was back in the palace. It just answered Madrid now. In 1865, the title was elevated again to a full dukedom, the Duke of Moctezuma. And that title did not die out in some dusty archive. It exists right now, today. The current holder of the senior line is a Spanish nobleman named Juan José Marsella de Terrell Moctezuma y Valcárcel. He is the 6th Duke of Moctezuma de Tultengo and a grandee of Spain. He carries, in his own name, the surname of the last emperor of the Aztecs, and he lives in modern Spain as a Spanish aristocrat, and the bloodline did not stop with him. It spread through some of the greatest houses in Spain. Through marriage across the centuries, Moctezuma's descendants connect to the highest tier of the Spanish nobility. There are several hundred documented descendants in Spain today who still carry the name, and an estimated 500 to 700 more in Mexico. And there is the money. Centuries later, a second part of the story surfaced. When Cortés handed Isabel the estate of Tacuba, it came with an income. Over the centuries, as that system was dismantled, the income was converted into a pension, a perpetual payment owed to Moctezuma's heirs as compensation for the lands taken from the family. And here is the part that genuinely stuns people. After Mexico won its independence from Spain, the new Mexican government kept paying it. A republic born from throwing off Spanish rule continued cutting checks to the descendants of the Aztec emperor, year after year. It ran until 1934. In the early 1930s, a Mexican president named Abelardo Rodriguez finally asked Congress to end it, and the payments stopped. According to a researcher at Mexico's National University who tracked the figures, the pension at the moment it was cut was worth more than 5 million gold pesos. The descendants tried to have it restored in 1991 and again in 2003. They were refused both times. A payment that started under Spanish kings, survived a war of independence, and outlived the entire Aztec Empire by 400 years, ended by a single signature in 1934. And no, I'm not making that up. There is one more moment, and it is the one to end on. On the 8th of November 2019, exactly 500 years to the day after Moctezuma and Cortés met on the causeway, two men met in a church in the historic center of Mexico City. One was a descendant of Moctezuma. The other was a descendant of Hernán Cortés, an Italian man carrying the conqueror's blood down 16 generations. They shook hands. And then the descendant of Cortés said something to the descendant of Moctezuma. He asked for forgiveness for all the bad things that had happened. 5 centuries after the women of that palace smeared mud on their faces to survive, after the branding irons and the lakeshore and the lost children, the blood of the conqueror stood in front of the blood of the conquered, in the city they had both been born from, and asked to be forgiven. That is what Spain did to the house of Moctezuma. It tried to erase it. It branded it, scattered it, took its women and its children and its capital. And 500 years later, the name it tried to destroy is carried by in Madrid, claimed by some of the proudest families in Spain, and was still owed money by the government of Mexico within living memory. The empire was destroyed in a single morning. The bloodline outlasted everyone who tried to end it. The number was never 3,000. That was a story told by a man who was never there, about women he never met, to make a conquest look justified. The real story is smaller and harder, and it does not let anyone off the hook. A wing full of women who were treasury and alliance and workshop, and, yes, captives, most of whom vanished into the worst 18 months in the history of their world. And one girl among them who refused to disappear and carried a dead empire's blood into the courts of the people who killed it. If you want to see another royal house meet its end like this, watch what happened to the Ottoman dynasty when 600 years of empire collapsed into a single back gate escape in a military ambulance. The last sultan's family scattered across the earth, and where their descendants ended up will stay with you. It's on screen now.